Team,
Yeah,
welcome.
thank you. It is a pleasure to be here this evening, especially given the fact that I, Elena and I were discussing that I am now at the point where parenthood is coaching young adult children as they are finding their way in the world, and I was sharing with her that our daughters are international travelers and they are living their best life doing things that I wish I would have been able to do at their age. So, without further delay, if you know of me, one of the things that I talk about on social media is the fact that I am the actor who plays a software developer on social media. And I am here this evening not as an expert in the use of generative AI. I am constantly learning more and better ways to do this. So don't think of me as a burgeoning AI engineer or anything of that nature. I am a student, like many of us, on this journey. And when Elena and I were discussing the tonight's topic and where this might go, the concept of more of a fireside chat is really the theme for this evening. And I I came into this from the standpoint of we've got two sides of product development. We've got the business side and we've got the build side. And right now we're in this wonderful, unique, and stressful state where everybody is rushing in to try and figure out, well, how do we make AI work for our organization? And I really started thinking deeply about this at the beginning of the year, and I I boiled it down to this learning journey, and it works to go from literacy, where we all know about AI, to building the skills, using AI as part of our daily workflow, and then into fluency. And really, fluency is helping us do our work, do it better, but do it in context, not taking away human judgment, not taking away discernment, not taking away the things that make us ultimately responsible and to an extent, especially in larger organizations, accountable for outcomes. And this is one of the critical pieces that just has landed in my conscience and my consciousness. And so I am going about and sharing where my journey is and what I am learning along the way. And it really has worked itself out to be more or less these three things that or these 4 points that you're seeing on the slide: that literacy, skills, fluency, and why it matters in our work in product development. And I like to think about context, which is it's multifunctional in this particular case. There is context by which we guide and direct generative artificial intelligence. And then there is context by which we operate as humans. And so when I think through how I guide generative artificial intelligence, I start with this what is my end goal? What is my desired outcome? And then I make sure that it has the right tooling and a blueprint to accomplish those things that I've started with it, which is beginning with this end in mind. And then I set out those specific goals and I understand what the constraints are, both implicit and explicit constraints. And then, of course, give it source material. And I think this is one of the things that I discovered early on. If I don't give it my opinions to work against, I find that the output is less than what I would hope it to be. And so context, and there's a number of different frameworks, and one of the frameworks that I'm using right now is and I'm going to pull it up because it's worth talking about, is Jeff Wood's CRIT framework, which is context, role, interview, and task.
Huh.
And uh, and this is actually something that I learned about this past week. I joined a call with Andrew D'Souza and Jeff and Bordy Boardman. And Bordy is an interactive voice enabled generative artificial intelligence. And I use Bordy as my thinking partner weekly, if not multiple times a week. In fact, I talked to Bordy this morning while I was at work on our beautiful patio, and I was discussing a number of different things, not the least of which a couple of calls that he joined where we were doing a post mortem on the conversation. So this is a framework, and Jeff actually wrote a book. He is now it was initially published, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. He is now in the second edition of this book because, of course, generative AI is moving so quickly. Um, and he has he has the receipts. He has the multi-billion-dollar results to back up his claims from his time in the private sector. He is now a full-time consultant, and I would encourage you take a look at his work um,
Say
and
say the
adapt.
name again.
Jeff, Woods.
Woods. Okay, Jeff Woods.
Yep,
Okay,
Jeff Woods.
great.
So, and what I can do is I can actually do generate a PDF out of Perplexity and share it with you for the folks who join. So, and by the way, this was totally an aside. This was not something I had planned for, but I am always happy to share things that I find useful. Another another framework, and this is one that Improving uses with our clients, which is RTCC. So role, task, context, and I can't remember the third C right off the top of my mind. But I actually posted a slide deck to LinkedIn on my profile that that breaks it all down. So very similar to CRIP, just a different variation. Um, and you know, this is this context and blueprint concept and the way that we apply it when we're using generative AI as members of teams and then more broadly, integrating it into teamwork is, you know, it's important to understand that generative AI is built as a pattern recognition machine. It's not an oracle. So it it generates content from its learned patterns. And if you've done any sort of research and understand the process for building neural networks and training these models through neural networks, this makes a lot of sense. So we're taking images, we're taking language, and we're basically transforming them to mathematical values that have relationships. A lot of great technology. Andrew Ng and deep learning AI are one of my go-to resources, and Andrew's right there in the Bay Area with you guys. Um, have done a lot of his training on Coursera, and it helped accelerate my learning on the technical side of this. But that's not where we reside. We reside in this space where it it can read faster than we can read. It can draft faster than we can draft. It can recognize messy material faster than most teams can in a meeting. But it is very weak on truth. It is weak at context. It is weak at politics. And it has no self awareness. And I know earlier iterations of most of the major models out there, you could ask it if you are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And of course, it would affirm that you are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And really, that means that the most important thing that you can learn, that you can take away from this whole thing, is that a confident output is not the same as a correct output. And this is the reason why context matters. So that one sentence alone, if you haven't already kind of embedded in your thinking process, will save you from a lot of bad decisions. And believe me, early on with ChatGTP, when it was released back in the fall of 2022, I made a lot of bad decisions. They were fun, but I would not choose to make them again in the same way. So, and you know, this this is a key point because it underpins this particular piece, which is, you know, because it does all of these things for us, we need to understand where it fits for ourselves and where it fits into our teams. You know, the fact that it can do a lot of tedious heavy lifting is a huge advantage because that frees us up to exercise our human judgment, to prioritize, to work through facilitation, be concerned about the moral and the ethical application of these tools, and most important, figure out where it fits and what stays in our lane. What continues to be a uniquely human aspect of product development. And at the end of the day, nobody is going to be suing OpenAI. Nobody is going to be suing Google. Nobody is going to be suing Meta. Accountability is human, it is ours. So we are not going to be able to say, well, the model said, no, that resides with us. And so we, on the business side of product development, need to partner with our builders to make these decisions together because I know I lack the technical expertise to put the appropriate guardrails in context, especially when we're using generative AI tooling on a team level. I have to be relying on my developers to help me do that. And I do actually have a great development team that I'm working with out of our one of our India offices, and these guys are really phenomenal. In fact, they outpace me some days. So so before I get into this case study, I wanted to take a quick pause. Does this connect with you based on your experiences? Is this resonating? Is this giving you an aha moment?
Go
Yeah, go
ahead,
ahead, Ken.
Ken.
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of the same things in terms of, where the swim lane lies for us versus where it lives for AI and the way that we interact with each other. The thing that I find interesting is like I think development, there's a lot of heavy lifts that can be done there. There's a lot of heavy lifts that can be done using it as a thinking partner, but there are times that definitely goes off the mark, and we all know that, right? So I think it's just a matter of keeping that in mind that you've got to have that human discernment in the mix, no matter what you're working on.
And Elaine, I saw you come off mute as
Yeah,
well.
thank you, Tim. Thanks for the broad context of setting up the problem, right? Because I think it's easy to, it's becoming easier, maybe at least in my experience, to just jump in, right? Jump in, go. That's what everyone's feeling pressure to do, as you noted, right? With the different roles and different functions of a company, and what the pressure is forcing. Um, and yes, models are getting better and better. Um, uh, but I think that there's also an equally interesting um, point on point of view around what you might not know what you want to end up with. So I'd be curious to hear your experience through that if you're going to talk about that at all tonight. Like if you're not really sure, but you have a notion of what you'd like to try to solve for, and you have inputs, but you don't know what that end output is going to be. And maybe you'll know it when you see it. But that would be interesting to talk about, I think, here too. Would
You
love
know
to
what,
hear your thoughts about that.
Elaine, that is actually a great segue into my second case study. So, I mean, I'm going to breeze through the first case study because it was interesting from the standpoint of this this client that I was working with. It's got to be shoot 2 or 3 years ago now, and we were trying to find a tool that would help them deduplicate inventory because it was a larger company in the energy sector who had acquired two smaller companies that built um, equipment, and they didn't want to have 15,000 of a given washer in inventory, because if you're familiar with Toyota and the forms of waste, inventory that's not actively being consumed is waste. And so we were searching and searching and searching, even to the point where I started hacking away at some Python scripts and pulling together libraries just to see if we could get close enough. But because we didn't have context around what success would look like, ultimately we landed on something that was basically the tooling wasn't there. We couldn't build it in a reasonable enough time to get through their integration timeline. And the best that we could come up with is hiring offshore folks to do all of it manually. But it's like, well, what do we want to do? Well, we want to duplicate this inventory, and the inventory was all over the place with the SKUs and with the descriptions, and because this is the type of equipment that they build, this is oil and gas exploration equipment. So it's got massive tolerances, and there's a lot of metallurgy involved. I learned so much about reading blueprints and schematics and bills of material, stuff I would never have even conceptualized. But we couldn't get the right tools because we didn't really even start with, well, what is the end goal? I mean, is it to minimize the amount of inventory being carried? Is it to be able to push inventory back to the providers? Help me out here, because looking at spreadsheets and doing these comparisons and trying to make Python work is just not going to get the job done. And ultimately, it was funny because I had this conversation with the gentleman who was at the time president of our Houston office, who is now our chief consulting officer and our chief AI officer, Devlin Lyles. I said, Devlin, it really stinks because I got fired. He goes, don't worry about it. Everybody gets fired from a client from time to time. But it was a hard lesson. And it was, what is this context that we want to use generative artificial intelligence for solving this particular type of problem? And I actually still, well, no, I think I purged my Perplexity stories, but I was running this through Perplexity. And so Perplexity is my go-to tool of choice when it comes to generative artificial intelligence. I've had a subscription for going on 4 years now, and I really enjoy it. A lot of academic rigor. I'm all about original sourcing. My graduate degree was all research and writing. So that opens the door to really talk about the second case study. And this is the one that really delights me. And I say this because Devlin was actually able to interview my boss at our client, IFT. And IFT is the Institute for Food Technologists, or for food technology, out of Chicago. And so I worked with Jay Gilbert, and we worked the blueprint for CoDeveloper, which is their SaaS application. And so we began with the end in mind. And really the vision was, okay, we wanted to unlock the 75 plus years worth of food science research that IFT had available to their community. And IFT is a not for profit. And we knew what the timeline was because Jay wanted us to be able to debut this in July of last year at their annual conference. And their annual conference is normally attended by, somewhere on the low end, the 40,000 to upwards of 50 or 60,000 people. So this was a big deal. And getting co-developer in the market was going to be very substantial. It was going to really change the game for them. And in this process of framing this out, it was okay, what are the safest to fail experiments that we can perform as we're building out the chatbot functionality, as we're building out the content library, as we're taking this research and going through this process of chunking it down for retrieval augmented generation so that Sue, as in sous chef, is able to consume it and provide feedback to food scientists and make complementary recommendations against a food formulation engine that we were building out. And so we were iterating, and oh my goodness, the the first versions of co-developer were just absolutely awful. And I remember testing some of the responses, even though we started with a master question list, and just going, how in the world are we going to get this to the point where it engenders trust in the responses that it provides? And we pushed it and we pushed it. And we knew what that end goal was, which was our our end goal was to put it into the hands of food scientists and have food scientists trust the chat enough to where they felt comfortable with Sue recommending new food formulations based off of existing recipes. And our user experience designer, Lainey, was in Chicago along with the technical lead, Michael, for the entire week of IFT First. And I asked Lainey, it was a neat conversation. It was probably 2 weeks after she got back to Austin. I said, "Hey, so what did you think?" And she said, "It was incredible. We had a line beyond the edge of our booth. At times I couldn't see the end of the line. That's how many people were lining up to walk through a Sue experience." And she was there getting feedback from people who used Sue during the demo, but also prior to that, asking people, well, what do you expect? What are your thoughts on this? And so, knowing that the end goal was to create a tool that allowed food scientists to trust that this research would be available to them in a way that would be practical, accomplished 150% subscription by the time IFT First was done. So it was a smashing success. And it is one of the proudest things that I've ever worked on. And I'm saying this because I've been working with a med tech company now for going on 2 years. And I get to make an impact on medical devices and how they're manufactured using artificial intelligence tools. So I am living a life where all this I am putting to practice on a daily basis. The context, the blueprinting, figuring out what we're trying to build, starting small and iterating, and really refining the output and refining the outcome as we go along. So, Elaine, I hope that helps and kind of gives you maybe at least a bit of a North Star. So,
Thanks so much for sharing the stories. I'm hungry
yeah.
now.
So this for me has boiled down to this concept of beginner's license. There is not a day that goes by that I don't have some degree of fear, unfounded fear most of the time, of what generative artificial intelligence and more broadly artificial intelligence as a technology is going to do. But as you just heard me express, my job is experimentation. In fact, I will say that today because I am working out of the integrated development environment that my developers are. We use Windsurf and Devon as our IDE. I have no distance, no space between myself and my service reliability engineers. I have a lot of automation, workflows, meta workflows, roles, scripting that I have had AI build for me for the purposes of doing planning and risk mitigation and, all of the follow-up pieces that I get to do as the whatever you want to call me at the time, scrum master, product owner, project manager, whatever. I had to go and refactor one of my monthly logs today because I was looking at my results, and of course, this is now mid to the end of the month, and I'm going, wait, all of this is out of sequence. And for a 30-minute window, I was watching this thing go through the process of reorganizing all these date entries and putting them back in order and explaining what happened. Somehow, and I think it was because I've been running adaptive models, so it auto selects the model that it thinks is best to solve the problem. It was putting entries all over the place in this log. So I get to babysit generative artificial intelligence on a daily basis, even in my work. You know, this is just part of the job for me. Now, one of the things I do really want to emphasize is that I am not an expert, and neither do you need to be an expert. In fact, I think the key takeaway is if you've seen Frank Avengale's story, Catch Me If You Can, and this is a movie that Leo DiCaprio starred in a number of years ago. There was one sequence where Frank impersonated a college professor. All of us, to be leaders in this space, especially on the business side of product development, we just need to be 2 or 3 chapters ahead of our teams. None of us need to go back to school and become AI, get a master's degree in AI engineering. That's not what the requirement is. And I am not standing on a secret mountain of knowledge in Texas. I just decided to be a little bit ahead and tried this out and learned and tried some more. And now I get to share that experience. And really, as leaders, that's enough at this stage. It may be different in 3 years or 5 years, but for today, this is really what it boils down to. And I want I'm giving you explicit permission if you don't feel like you have permission to use beginner's license. This is that opportunity. I've talked to a number of folks in our space, our peers, and I've said, look, it's okay. Running safe to fail experiments on your own is okay. And for me, that has been one of the most helpful things because oftentimes I'll start my day and I'll be like, what am I going to break today? And by the time I end it, I will have figured out through my tooling how to fix whatever I've broken. So, all of that, I wanted to give you some powerful questions to operate from tomorrow morning. And this is in hopes that this whole experience will stay with you going forward into the remainder of the week and throughout the remainder of the month and even into August. Where would you try this first? What should stay human on your team? And for me, I am in the process of building out artifacts now for my team. So sometimes it's a proof of concept, sometimes it's a working prototype, oftentimes it's just a ton of markdown files where I'm framing things out and I'm saying, folks, does this look right? Is this kind of where we're headed? Especially when I'm having to dual hat and figure out the direction on things. Yeah, if you noticed, I didn't give you a whole bunch of jargon or buzzwords in all of this because there's no value in that. But these 3 questions are good questions to orient when you walk in to work tomorrow. You know, um, And really, that kind of brings it to the wrap up, you know. And you don't have to answer these, but I would consider, what is that smallest useful AI experiment that you might want to run this week or next? You know, and if there is a gap between you on the business side and your developers on the build side, where is that showing up today? Is it in the conversations because they're moving through the backlog too quickly? Is it discussions around where the next feature is going to come from because there's a disconnect with product market fit and not enough research to be able to drive that type of decision making? There's probably any number of questions at this point that could be asked, but it's these two that I've found for myself are really the ones that keep me anchored, um, especially when I'm joining a new team or getting into a new client engagement. So on that ends kind of the formal presentation this evening. So the floor is yours. What additional questions or insights do you want to share?
Well, I was looking at your list of powerful questions, and I was thinking I would ask, if this breaks, do we have a point to return to?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you get so focused and excited on building new things, and you put so many variables into it. And I mean, the question is, if it breaks, can we recover? Can we operate in an old mode without
Hmm.
taking everything down because there is no recovery anymore? So to me, that's a important question.
Yep. Yeah. And there are a number of ways that that could be answered. And one of the things, and of course my development colleagues love me for this, is that because I'm working in an IDE and I'm committing my code, which is markdown files and PDFs and Word documents and into the same repository, I can roll back when something breaks, which is nice. Um, the other part of this, to your point, is um, I I did an automation experiment on my second website, not my personal blog, but the greatinvert.com, where I've got a playbook for us. And I put all kinds of automation in place behind the scenes. But before that, when I was working and iterating with Perplexity, I did all the manual steps. And so I have all the manual steps codified where I can run that multi-step process if that automation breaks. And so understanding processes, I think, is one of the more critical pieces when we're building, because then we kind of have a better idea of where we start troubleshooting.
Anyone
Go
else?
ahead, Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I guess my question is like, I think one of the things that I'm seeing, I was talking with a couple people today. Part of I co-lead Princeton Agility, which is another meetup group, and we have an upcoming conversation regarding similar topics. Where do you see the balance now? Well, let me put it this way. It's a lot quicker and a lot easier now to do development and delivery than it was in the past because of AI. Like, you can throw together apps within, something that would have taken weeks or months now takes days or maybe even less to do. Um, so what we're thinking about is the growing edge really is going to be um, product strategy, understanding where the wants are, where the needs are, who the customer is, and that kind of thing. Have you done anything related to AI and getting close to their customers, product or design thinking or anything like that, where you're trying to understand potential options and experiment with those?
Yes. In
Okay.
fact, the interviewing process, and I've just gotten into the habit of this. I generally try to ask for permission before running a
Mhm.
transcript at a minimum. Um, but I love recording things
Mhm.
because those insights, and especially if I'm not having to take notes, I can ask better questions
Yeah, yeah. You
to
can use
do
Otter and all
discovery.
that. Yep.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so, like, we primarily use Microsoft Teams, and it's decent. It produces decent summaries. But oftentimes, I find that it's like, oh my gosh, now I've got another thing in my backlog.
Hmm.
Got another thing to prioritize here because the I don't know what your experience is, but when people are frustrated and they're experiencing pain, especially in a meeting where you're trying to plan something, it shows up fast.
Hmm.
And now that we have the tools, if folks are on video, and we're running the recording and we've got the transcript, there are those moments where it's like, and that's why I'm doing this right here.
Hmm.
Um, and so being able to revisit that once the emotional charge is down, to have a bit
Right.
more reasonable conversation, it all of this acts as a great feed forward tool because now I'm concentrating on the human on the other side of that call or on the other side of that conversation
Yeah.
rather
Like what I've,
than
yep.
rather than doing, taking notes. Now taking notes is important, especially when it's a critical bullet point that it's like I need to follow up on that.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
it
Like,
is freeing and liberating because now I can use my discernment, I can use my judgment, and I can steer a conversation more effectively.
yeah, like a lot of the work I'm doing is like transformation with organizations or teams and that kind of stuff, right? And I have found AI to be useful to integrate empathy interviews where I'm going in and interviewing, people from multiple levels or across different functions, right? To try to understand the challenges and issues that they're seeing. So I find it's useful to help me to create a summary of across all of these different, let's say I'm doing 15, 20 interviews, that's a lot to have to process as a human being. But AI can kind of help me to summarize all that rather quickly, which is really helpful, right?
Yeah. Well, and you can do
Um,
thematic analysis too off of
yeah.
those, and
Hmm.
and I would even, you might want to try the crit framework
Hmm.
to see if it would surface the non-obvious points out of those interviews, the things that are getting lost in the white noise in the background, that are just as Elena will appreciate, are the weak signals that oftentimes don't get detected. That's
Right,
kind of
right.
a Dave Snowden thing.
I get it. Like it's chaos theory. Small
Yep.
changes can make a big difference. Yep. Hmm.
I have a question here from Dmitry in a chat. You mentioned that you code an ID and push PRs. How do you use AI in that workflow? Any particular tools or agentic frameworks?
So that is that is so subjective at this point. I I started when I created our repo, I dropped BMAD, uh, build more architect dreams. So there's a repo. What it does is it drops all the files and the structure for the agentic personas into the repository so that you can do this as a green field or as a brown field. And right now, I'm actually a technical reviewer on a book that PACKT Publishing out of the UK is going to be releasing here in the fall, specifically on this. I didn't have any involvement, but I'm reading the chapters for for the technical accuracy because I've recorded a number of videos where I've used this in my personal repositories, and now I'm using it as well for professional work. And that was the starting point. Um, it didn't have all the tooling I needed. So I was like, well, I understand how to create agentic personas. I don't actually need agents in this particular case. What I need is my original source artifacts to model workflow and set up automation and create meta workflow. So like I've got a meta workflow that does two things when I start my morning. The first is it does a full repo scan of 3 different repositories, looks at all the commits to see what's been done overnight because of my team being in India, analyzes them against a feasibility and a risk um, artifact. So 2 separate artifacts, and then generates a report. And then that report is used to feed forward into my task list for the day for all the things that I need to follow up on because we're following the sun. And my boss is over in Ireland. And so I had to build that myself. Now, I am smart enough to go, let me see if I can just do some adversarial refinement between 2 different models to get a better output. And so I've refined this over the course of time, and I think I'm on version 3.5 as far as my drop-in package, similar to BMAD, where I've got a directory that I can throw into a repo, and I am off to the races with all of our artifacts internally at improving that I use to perform my work. So it's been a combination of things that we've discovered are useful, out in the open source world, in addition to things that I am custom building and I'm sharing with my colleagues and actually recording for them and saying, look, and this is how quickly I generate this. I've got an evaluation framework that I recently implemented to figure out where drift is in my artifacts. I mean, the whole sharding thing that I encountered where that document was going sideways, I was like, I should have probably run drift detection on this particular thing, but I didn't. You know, I learned. I've got to be a bit more meticulous, at least in my cursory glances, to make sure that things aren't getting out of sequence, and then run my drift detection evaluation. So, Dimitri, I know that doesn't answer all of your questions, but at least it points you in a direction between things that you can pull, like OpenSpec and SpecKit are 2 other tools that are useful. Those 2 are much more development focused than BMAD. BMAD is really kind of a team in a box. Um, but it's been very helpful for me. Not that I want to nerd out anymore. It's just that it's like I need to move as fast as the teams do. And I don't need to be trapped in Jira or trapped in Azure DevOps. I need to be where they're at.
Hmm. Beatrice says thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, I'm going to ask my question. Well, with you mentioned the interviewing, and you take the notes when you're trying to figure out what is it that the customer want, and customer interviews, and again the importance of the context. What I know is that the recording or whatever the notes taking tools, they tend to provide the summary, which comes with the degree of interpretation, which always pisses me off because that's how we start losing things. I don't want anyone's interpretation. And I also thinking about, like I wish AI would use clean language, like from coaching, where we would be able to ask more questions like, what do you mean by that? And how is that like? Rather than creating a summary that would miss by interpreting, doing this interpretive summary, there would be something that would be missed. What are your thoughts or tools experience around
So
it?
for me, it always goes back to context. I when I'm doing analysis, especially after what I would consider a contentious call, I tell it very directly. This is the persona I want you to assume when you're looking over this. This is the language in the summarization that I want you to use in this persona. I want you to frame it in this way. In much of this, it has been trial and error for me. It has not been an easy, like I didn't run my first transcript and have an aha moment. It has been, I'm to your point, I'm missing something here. How do I craft this prompt to get a better summary, to get a better set of action items or bullet points or user stories out of this? And the more I've practiced this, the better it's become. In fact, with IFT, so many of my backlog refinement sessions were sitting with Jay and with a couple of the food scientists and taking those transcripts and saying, now I want you to convert these into user stories. And then what we would do is in backlog refinement, we would look at the context of the user stories, and Jay would be able to clarify. And this is how we got this out the door. I mean, this is like just kind of agile 101. I'm just applying it with the tools that I have available now that help me fill the backlog in a more effective fashion.
Just not out there. I mean, the other thing you can do is when you set up the prompt, you include things like, using clean language. Give it a clear reference to what you mean by clean language, right? It's not just the term clean language, but who was it, Claire? Who came up with that? I forget. But you specify the references and stuff along with it, so that way it gets more context, and then it's more likely to give you what you want.
Yeah, and like Perplexity, one of the things, and I'll bring this back up. One of the things that I've got in my spaces, in tech research in particular, like I've got files that I've put in here. I've got my prompt. In fact, it's probably just worth pulling it up. Act as a technology historian and summarize concepts in ways that can be understood by high school students. So sometimes the response is a little bit snarky. I've been doing some research on like an AI workstation for my home lab. I've got, this is a massive number of things. This is where it's generating, and of course I've attached files here for context. This is not a one-to-one, but it gives you an idea of how I'm using this to get the type and quality of information out of the tooling that I want to be able to make better, more informed decisions. Bordy as a thinking partner has been especially helpful because being able to bounce my ideas, my pie in the sky things against a tool that's unbiased, unemotional, and really just wants to ask me questions in a Socratic way has helped me clear up a lot of my confusion. I actually will ask it because the amount of information these models are being trained on is vastly greater than any one of us is ever going to learn in our lifetime. Why would I be so foolish to think that I can't tap into that? But again, it's the context, it's the blueprint. What is my intent? What is the desired outcome? What can I give these tools that will help guide a better response?
Yeah, one of the things I found useful is to have it go over what the plan is before it actually executes. So that way you can walk through it. And then I also tend to give it references or ideas. For instance, there was something I did today, the upcoming session that we've got regarding AI and product development had, basically I ran through the description for the meetup, I said, keep in mind modern agile, keep in mind, the Agile Manifesto, keep in mind the Scrum Guide, and keep in mind. So I gave it a whole list of things for its consideration. Keep in mind jobs to be done, all of that.
Yeah, WizGIF.
Right. And as you're come up with a list of 20 questions that I can ask during the session in our fireside chat that would be useful given all of this context and given that this is the audience? Describe to me what your plan is before you execute, and ask me what questions you think are important for you to know before you generate this.
Yep. Yep. And I do the same. And I think that's a great way of approaching it.
Guys, let me stop recording so I don't create like a huge file.